Rahim. My dear students, Assalamu alaikum. My name is Dr. Muhammad Shafiq and I am lecturer of philosophy at Department of Islamic and Pakistan Studies. And the course I am teaching you is called Introduction to Logic and the course code is PHI 101. This is lecture number 11 and today we are going to discuss what is an argument in logic. So, before going into details about what is an argument, first we need to understand why an argument is needed. As you know, the whole purpose of this course, Introduction to Logic, is to understand those methods and principles which govern reasoning, which govern argument. Now, why argument is important in our lives? As we know that human being is the only species which has been blessed by God with the faculty of intellect. While living in the society, we always need reasoning to convince people in order to progress, in order to live a successful life. We need to convince people with our arguments, with our reasoning. So the speciality of human being is to convince people with the argument or reasoning rather than force, which is obviously speciality of other living beings. So man being blessed with the intellect, with the faculty of intellect, has got this ability to convince people with his reasoning and argument. So this is very much important for us to understand those methods and principles which govern reasoning or argument in order to equip ourselves with the tools to convince people successfully so that we can achieve our goals. Now, in previous lecture we discussed the first method or first principle of correct reasoning, and that is to say an argument or reasoning must be composed of propositions. Without propositions we cannot make an argument, we cannot compose an argument. And what is a proposition? Proposition, we understood that proposition are those sentences which assert or deny something. So for argument we need proposition, that's the first principle. Now what is argument itself, or how does it is composed? We'll see in our next slide. So the definition of an argument is a technical definition, I would say, is that an argument is a structured group of propositions which reflect an inference. An argument is that group of propositions which have a proper structure, and that group also reflects inference. Now in this definition there are two main terms which need to be understood. the structure group of propositions, and inference. So what is a proposition? That's what we know already from our previous lecture, that a proposition is that statement or that sentence which asserts or denies something. So that's the prerequisite for an argument, that you must have propositions. Now, what do we mean by structured group of propositions? There are different kinds of propositions. But in an argument, there are mainly two propositions, or two kinds of proposition rather. What one is called premise and the other one is called conclusion. Now, by structured group of propositions, it is meant that an argument must have at least one premise and one conclusion. The premise basically is that proposition which supports the conclusion, and conclusion is the proposition which is trying to make a point. For example, I say, the road is closed today, so the teacher is not coming. Or, the teacher is not coming today, therefore there is no class today. The first proposition, the teacher is not coming today, it is called premise. Why? Because it is setting the stage for the conclusion. It is trying to support the next statement, which is conclusion, which says, therefore there is no class today. Now, a conclusion is something which we are trying to prove, and the premise is the proposition which is delivered for the support of conclusion. But how we are going to understand, how we are going to differentiate which one is premise and which one is conclusion? So there are certain indicators of both premise and conclusion. Although this list is not exhaustible, I mean there are so many other terms, other indicators as well, but I have mentioned a few of them here. Like, if a proposition contains the terms or phrases like this, because teacher is not there today, therefore we do not have a class. So because, since, supposing that, assuming that, given that, all these kind of terms or phrases are the indicators of a premise. So if a proposition or statement has this term, these terms, or these phrases, that would mean that that proposition is a premise of an argument. While on the other hand, the conclusion indicators are such as therefore, thus, hence, consequently, ergo, so, etc., etc. So these are the indicators which help us to differentiate between a premise and conclusion. So coming back to the main thing, which is what do we mean by structure group, is that an argument must have a structured group of propositions, which means it must have at least one premise and one conclusion. That entails a single proposition can never be an argument. When we say structured group, by group we mean obviously more than one. And by structured we mean at least there is one premise and one conclusion. So the point to note here is a single proposition can never be an argument, and there must be a structure in those propositions in an argument. And that structure basically means an argument must have at least one premise and one conclusion. Now let's move on and see what do we mean by an inference. Obviously the definition of argument says it is a structured group of propositions which reflects inference. Now we know what a proposition is, and so far we have come to know what do we mean by a structured group of propositions. Now the third term which is very important in this definition, that is to understand inference. Inference basically is a process of link between the propositions. That means one proposition supports other. So it entails that the propositions in an argument must have some sort of link. It's not like if I say because the weather is cold today, hence he is tall. I mean, as far as the definition of an argument is concerned, this kind of argument fulfills the two criteria. It is composed of two propositions. One is the weather is nice today. The other proposition says therefore he is not tall. Both are propositions, and it's a group of propositions, and then there is a structure. One is a premise and the other one is conclusion, but still you cannot call it a correct reasoning or correct argument. Why? Because there is no link between the two two propositions. Because one proposition is talking about the weather, the other proposition is talking about the tallness. So there is no link, there is no match whatsoever between the two propositions. So still it's not an argument. So argument must reflect inference. These propositions must have some common thing or some link between them. Then we'll be able to call it a proper argument. That means one proposition supports the other. That means whatever one proposition is saying, the other would support it. It's not about, it's not like one proposition is talking about east and the other one is talking about west. So both propositions, or rather all the propositions in an argument must have a link between them, and that is called inference. When you deduce something with the help of this link between the proposition. So when we say that propositions are the building blocks of an argument, we also say that inference works like cement between those building blocks. So if there is no cement, you cannot call the heap of bricks a wall until and unless there is a structure, which means you put them in an order, and then there must be a cement between those bricks, and that would make it a wall. Similarly, we need propositions, we need a structured group of propositions, and we need inference. So these three things have to be present in an argument, otherwise it ceases to be an argument. Group of propositions, a structured group of propositions which reflect an inference. So an argument is a structured group of propositions which reflect an inference. This lecture, although it is quite brief and quite simple, but there are certain suggested readings for you in order to understand the argument properly, and there are a couple of books which we always recommend in the classroom, and you can see them on the slide, as well as the handouts I have given you in the classroom. So if you give it a read through those handouts and these books, you'll be in a better position to understand the argument. If you have any questions, please let me know so that we can discuss these questions, we can clarify them before starting with a new topic in my next lecture. Till then, thank you very much, and Khuda Hafiz.